Hi everyone, welcome to our May webinar on future-proofing your value proposition. Can I just do the customary test to make sure that I'm not talking to myself for the next 45 minutes? Can you hear me? Can you see slides? Not worried whether you see me or not, but if somebody could just reassure me that we're good. Splendid. Thanks everyone. Welcome. Good to see some familiar names. Particularly welcome. Okay, let's get underway. We have about 45 minutes or so of content to do, and then depending on discussion, etc., we'll see where it'll probably end up being just under the hour. Why are people talking about future-proofing? I guess another way of asking the question is, why do people come to use my services? Surprise, surprise, it's not always marketplace related. The number one reason why people might want to think about their future is, surprise enough maybe, but they feel bored about what they're currently doing. I remember Thomas Leonard saying this nearly 20 years ago. The number one problem of successful professionals is actually boredom. It's not lack of clients, it's not lack of fees, it's like they're just fed up doing the same thing year after year. So surprise, surprise. I see Ian has a problem with video or audio. Good. If there's any issues on technology, by the way, I'll allow the team deal with that, so I won't be responding to those. The number one reason is boredom. Second reason, of course, which we're all very conscious of, and it's more and more in the media now, is how technology is changing demand for all kinds of services. And replacing the jobs of quite a few people. One that's perhaps less visible, but one that I think it's really important to think about. In fact, a lot of my work is precisely on this, is anticipating how the customer's world is changing. It's not just enough to think about how our services might be impacted. We need to actually think up the food chain as well. Many people are, of course, concerned about competition, whether global players or more entrants in just about every arena. There's little doubt that in many of the sectors we're in, there is more competition than there was, let's say, 10 years ago. A significant factor for some is they have been dependent for a number of years on a few key relationships, very often the same 5 to 10 clients have been their regular source of revenue. And those people, whether because of age or because of organizational change, are retiring or moving on or reinventing themselves or whatever it might be. The word meaning is high on more and more people's agenda these days. They don't just want a job or a business or a career that earns money or that has achievement in it, but also is meaningful for them in some way or other. Mindful, of course, that meaning means very different things for different people. And quite a lot of people simply feel undervalued. They feel that they have a lot more to give and they want to have more impact, whether that's in the way in which they're working or whether that's multiplying the results they've already had with some clients and wishing to do that with others. So summing that up, I suppose some people are looking at the future and they want to change. Others feel that, as in that image in front of you, that the rug may well be pulled from under them, and they want to make sure that they anticipate that rather than become a victim of it. Now, I've invited onto the call today a man who has been thinking about these topics with me for quite a few years. That's Stuart Copeland. Stuart has been responsible for both business roles, as in operational roles, as well as projects for a very long period of time. He's been freelance since the millennium. Roughly around the same time as I started the coaching business, actually. He's been freelance as a project manager and taking on some very big demanding projects that I better not blow client confidentiality and start talking about. But I think it's fair to say that his main focus has been in the automotive sector and dealing with business change in the automotive sector. He's co-author of a book called The People Project Triangle. Don't go Googling it yet because it's not published, but it will be. Stuart can tell you more about that in a moment. And in addition to publishing and writing about project management and actually running demanding projects, he is now also mentoring project managers who want to be more business focused in their role. What have I missed, Stuart?
We did your microphone check as well, so hopefully everyone can hear me. No, I think that's a really good summary. Thank you very much, John. I don't think that pretty much covers up.
Well, you'll be hearing Stuart's voice a bit as we go through the webinar today, because he is the living embodiment of somebody who has been thinking about the future for some time and has anticipated many of the changes happening in his sector over the last few years. Our agenda. We're going to look at some of the classic pitfalls. I'm just going to focus on 3 of them. That could have been a list of 10, but you know, you're not here to talk about the pitfalls. We actually want to talk about how we deal with them. But there are 3 that are significant and that are recurring. They pop up time and time again with many professionals. There's 4 areas that we're then going to look at which are vulnerable. Not too many surprises there, I think, if you've been following this topic via the media elsewhere, but again, it's summing up 4 key vulnerable areas. By the way, not just as they apply to you, but also if your clients are in those areas. And then in the third part, we look at the 7 questions to ask, which is the title of today. What are the 7 questions that it's worth asking of yourself? We talk a little bit about the environment of change and the effect that has on us as humans, and that's pretty significant in the current climate. And we round off towards the end of the hour, or the end of 45 minutes, depending on how busy you are on the chat box, with 5 steps that I do recommend you start taking as soon as you can, really. Okay, let's start with the pitfalls. Here's a classic. It comes up quite a lot, possibly because we're in a climate, or we're in a society of introspection. A lot of the sheer quantity of introspection that's going on now, I think, is higher than we've seen ever. And there's a fashion there. And you'll often hear people say, well, okay, my job depends on relationships, not technology or information or process. And therefore, there will always be a need for what I'm doing, because I am a executive coach to people, and the service is one that crucially is human and relationship based, and therefore all of this talk about artificial intelligence really has nothing to do with me. That example illustrates 2 pitfalls in one, but let's take them one at a time. If that mythical executive coach happens to be selling their services into, let's say, financial services in London at the moment, then their job may very well be relationship based, but they're going to see massive change in their client base. So it's not enough to think about ourselves or our talents or our services, but we need, in thinking about the future, to think about how our customers and people and their customers, for that matter, are going to be impacted. And I often feel that my day-to-day work is about challenging some of the introspection that goes on, that we start looking outwards rather than just looking inwards when we're examining our approach to the future. The second pitfall is summed up in this iconic picture taken on Fifth Avenue. The picture on the top was taken, I think, in 1905, if memory serves me correctly. The picture in the bottom was taken in 1915. And by coincidence, Stuart is on the call, who has worked in automotive, so there's a kind of resonance here. There's only 10 years between the picture on the top and the picture on the bottom. And whenever we find ourselves thinking there will always be a need for X, and it really doesn't matter how that sentence ends, whatever that might be, we need to actually double check, because the pace of change today is far faster than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. So some of those changes, both in economy and in society, will be coming at us a lot quicker than they were 100 years ago. The third one, which I might invite Stuart to talk about, is the classic pitfall of not thinking about the future at all. This is quite real. A lot of people are busy. They're busy with their current projects, they're busy with today's clients, as a result of which they become so preoccupied with today's business, there simply is no headspace to think about future business. And that's a problem. Well, why is it a problem, Stuart? What's the problem about being so preoccupied with today that we don't have time to think about tomorrow?
I think as a sort of freelancer, you're always making sure that you can pay the bills. So it's inevitable that you are going to be wanting to focus on your current project to make sure that works so you can get some repeat business. So what you have to do is ensure that you've got time to think about the future. I think John further on the slides talks about some of the ways that you might do that, but it's so easy to get into a routine of doing lots of work. You look up for your next project and you find out you're doing something similar, but all around you, the businesses or the sectors that you're working have moved ahead, and then you find out that you're a bit behind the times.
Yep, indeed. And this is the risk of the freelancer, or indeed the entrepreneur, or for that matter, the career professional who is so focused on today, they don't have time to think about tomorrow. There are other reasons too, which I'll talk a little. They're human, they're psychological reasons, which we'll come to later on in the webinar. Okay, that's the pitfalls. Let's look at the vulnerable areas. Top of the list. Well, no accident that Stuart is here. In fact, this slide is probably the reason that he's here, because you know this territory really well. Again, nothing very new here now. We've seen in just about every sector for the last 20 years, we have seen that the middleman or the middle person, wherever they may be, is vulnerable. We saw it in the travel industry. It's hard to believe that there used to be a travel agent or multiple travel agents on every high street only a short time ago, less than 2 decades ago. And yet now you really have to look for one. Agencies, dealers, anyone who is in a middle position in a supply chain is vulnerable. Take automotive as an example, Stuart.
Under massive change at the moment. I jokingly say that it's done a change curve of 120 years, which has been flat, and now the change curve is vertical. But that's been driven by climate change and government insisting on lower emissions from car manufacturers. Customer expectations are way beyond what I think the car industry can deliver at the moment. There's a move to city dwelling, so that brings into all sorts of new ways of thinking about car ownership. And there's a few disruptors out there, so Tesla are getting involved. So that covers the whole sort of industry supply chain. Technology also means that, in theory, at some point in the future, the manufacturers could literally sell cars from the manufacturing bases. However, traditionally, they've really been concerned about their brand and also the ability for them to be able to fulfill. So it's actually quite tricky selling a big thing like a car and then servicing it. So at the moment, the dealers do that, but in the future, who knows? I mean, in the industry, everyone's looking at all sorts of different models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, anyone in the middle of the supply chain is quite vulnerable. Second group who are vulnerable. Again, you're going to say this isn't new, but let's just reflect. Let's just think about where it's going. Anyone who's giving information. Now here, trainers should definitely pay attention to this because anything that involves training is definitely falls into the category of giving information. And there is little doubt that it's far easier to gather information online. It is far easier to gather information from, in your own time, in your own place, when you feel like it. I mean, for everyone who's on this webinar today, there will be even more people watching and downloading the recording. So there's little doubt, and again, events like today, which are happening online, you know, only a decade plus ago would probably have been happening face to face. So the giving of information in the future, this will go way beyond video. We're looking at, you know, much more intelligent search engines who will help us to pinpoint the information we want an awful lot more easily than we might today. So the whole idea of charging for information is pretty much already knocked on the head. And I say that as somebody who's just published a book. You know, I am aware of the fact that this is, you know, if we only have to look at what's happening in the book industry and in the media to know that information provision is definitely a vulnerable sector. Here's one that's maybe more controversial, but I couldn't help but notice an article yesterday shared, I forget where, see what I mean about information. Google AI is now better able to detect lung cancer than 6 human radiologists. The success rate was 5 times higher, so the humans missed 5% of the diagnosis that the artificial intelligence was able to capture, and it yielded something like 11% fewer false positives. So it was more accurate. We are increasing, just as the computers now tend to outperform the human chess players, anything that involves diagnostics is vulnerable. Just to take an example, suppose that you might be tempted to reach out today to a social media expert, somebody who will go through your Twitter and your Facebook and your LinkedIn accounts and make recommendations. I don't think we're far away from the day when that can be done through an automated process, who will probably make much more niche and targeted recommendations about what you need to do, and will probably do them for you if you take out the right subscription, than any human ever could. Why? Because when it comes to diagnostics, we're now pretty much in the age where automated processes are doing it better than humans are. They don't have the Monday, Friday factor. They don't be less aware or less awake after lunch. They don't need a lot of the maintenance that humans do. The example that I saw recently that I found very striking, somebody said the doctor's job is vulnerable, but the nurse's job is less so. Now, whether you agree or disagree with that, for me, it captures the essence of what this is about. The more the job is relationship-based, it is perhaps less vulnerable, but the more that it's diagnostic, or in a moment we'll see file processing based, then it is more so. And that takes me to the fourth vulnerable area, which of course is really what the City of London, for example, needs to be paying attention to, rather than certain political developments, which I won't speak about. But the impact on any major municipal city today, and particularly if it's heavily dependent on file processing, whether that be financial services, banking, insurance, anything that essentially is information-based. There is little doubt that those sectors are going to, are already, it's already started. This is not just future-related stuff. This is very much related to what's happening today and what we're going to see an awful lot more of. So we are definitely in times of change. Anything to add to that, Stuart, before we, or anyone on the chat box wish to add any other areas before we move on? Stuart.
Did you get that?
Yeah, got it. I'm checking chat box. Chat box today is all about Firefox and Chrome and other exciting technology. See, here we are talking about information technology, and at the same time we're still grappling with how to send an email and how to log on to a webinar. Indeed, both realities are part of today. Okay, let us move on to why you're all here, which is what are the 7 questions worth asking. As Peter Drucker, and not Ducker, by the way, I made a mistake in the newsletter, or rather, the artificial intelligence made a mistake in the newsletter and changed Druck to Duck. But as Peter Drucker famously said, best way to predict the future is to create it. And what we're trying to do here is not be victims of change, but actually get in there and be a part of the change. Leon, I will. I have the link on the Google AI piece, and I will enclose it with the email that goes out after the webinar, so you can read the source data for yourself, rather than go down that rabbit hole for an hour and a half. But indeed, it's quite intriguing, and there are some subtleties to that research as well. Moving on, best way to predict the future is to create it. So how do we start doing that? I would suggest the first question should be a who question and not a what question. When professionals approach the future, they quite naturally tend to approach it from the vantage point of their expertise. Of course, because it's our professional activity that tends to define us. Whether it should or shouldn't is another discussion. But we tend to say, I am an accountant, I am an IT professional, I am a web developer, etc. But what is perhaps more significant when approaching the future is who do you want to work with, rather than what do you want to do. Why? Because the what's going to change. And as we'll see at the moment, there's some tangible advantages in thinking about the who rather than thinking about the what. What it also does is it serves to get us out of this self-preoccupation that I'm becoming increasingly convinced is the greatest blight of the 21st century. It gets us out of the narcissism. It gets us out of the navel gazing. It forces our eyes outwards towards what's going on out there, rather than another vortex of introspection about our own fears and insecurities and meaning of life and philosophy and all that other stuff. And in doing so, it does us a service. So the question I usually like to start with is, who do you want to work with? Mindful that might be disparate lists. There might not be a single answer to that question. But as you begin to contemplate, you begin to think about that, about who you want to work with, then it opens up other avenues of inquiry. Notably, exactly as Stuart has been doing, and I'll let him talk about this in a moment, it opens up the question, how will they be affected? I.e., how will automotive be affected, rather than how will I be affected? Our value in the marketplace depends upon anticipating the issues of other people, not navel gazing. So it's not by acquiring another qualification that we become valuable. It's by anticipating how other people's future will be different to their past. That's how we can position ourselves for high value work, or indeed getting work. So being clear about the who and being clear allows us to do some research, if you like. It allows us to start exploring how others might be affected. And a quite natural third question is, look for some evidence of that already. Because sometimes we project effects onto the marketplace, which are not necessarily there. They're often in our heads and we project them outwards. So again, it's a good, it helps us both in our subsequent presentation, but it even helps us in our exploring to look for evidence. So if there's change coming up, what is the evidence for that? Stuart, do you want to talk a little bit about the work you've been doing over the last while to get ready if you like, and to find the evidence of change in your sector?
Yeah, I had some time last summer and was really investigating what is going on in it's our industry. The automotive sector is in the public domain, so therefore there are plenty of avenues that you can observe what's going on. There are consultants' reports published and things like that, so you get an understanding of where lots of other people are seeing the industry in the future. Then the second thing is looking at your network. Again, this is all about having time outside of the day job in inverted commas, but no, there's quite a few people I know who are working in the sort of consultancy end of the automotive sector. So it's just about having a chat with them, seeing them, and often you find that if you're curious about your sector, you can be, it's a lot more interesting in terms of the conversations you're having. But and this is something I'm obviously really keen to do, is as a project manager, it also makes you look a bit more interesting, which allows you to have conversations outside the day job. So I think that's sort of what I did. In terms of the sort of automotive sector, as I said earlier, the things around climate change, customer expectations, city dwelling disruptors are the forces. But over the last sort of 9 months, it's quite easy to see that the industry, from manufacturer through wholesaler through retailers, are looking at things around finance, electric vehicles, charging of the electric vehicles, sales pros, connected car, digital services, mobility as a service, self-driving car sharing. It's a fascinating long list of things that are happening, which is going to change the entire industry from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, finding that fascinating long list, and of course what is fascinating to somebody else might be different to what's fascinating to Stuart, or John, or anybody else. But finding that fascinating long list and starting to collect the evidence around that, this is precisely what this is about. We become fluent in the language of our marketplace. And that allows us to start thinking about who could be key partners in that process, because we don't have to do this single-handedly. There are many reasons why we shouldn't do it single-handedly. For one, it can be very lonely business. It can sometimes be very discouraging, because you may feel lost in the whole thing, or a sense that there's so much change going on, you'll never be able to position yourself in it. Having partners helps us to get perspective on that. And of course, it also helps us to gather more intelligence and to talk to more people than we could do on our own. Out of all that, we sooner or later, I'm bearing in mind that I've been doing this work now with quite a few people over a 5+ year period, this specific work, not just any old coaching work, but future proposition work. What invariably starts to emerge from it is what you stand for as an approach. And I don't just mean what are your values, which tend to be kind of abstract and quite often, to be honest, quite cliched words, but what kind of approach do you stand for in the marketplace? In Stuart's case, for example, what kind of project management is important in the context of a changing world? What kind of project management, Stuart, do you stand for?
As we've discussed over the years, the type of project management I believe is moving towards one where you need to be much more sensitive to the needs of the people that are working on projects, because often there are fewer sort of full-time project teams on the sort of mid-level projects that I tend to work on. So you're often working with people who have got day jobs, and just cranking the handle on the project management methodology will just really annoy them, probably preventing them wanting to do a project ever again. So without going into too much detail, it's about employing techniques that enable you to be able to deliver the project and not leave the people that you're working with in a pile of an anxious heap at the end of it.
bit like that picture in front of us. Yeah. Yeah. I've always been struck by one of the things you keep coming back to, which is that many of the people doing project management are doing it as what you often call homework. And that I found really helpful to remember when dealing with people who are having to juggle, let's say, operational roles and development roles. So we have to often remember the development role is on top of a full-time job already. And that does change a bit how we manage and motivate people like that. So that's an example from project management. But you know, if you were in web development, you probably would want to be looking at the changing ways in which people are navigating websites, and therefore an approach that improves response rates or something of that nature. What matters is to have an approach, not just self-promoting our own CV or self-promoting our own website. Most buyers these days are pretty immune to that. Okay, oops. And then if you've got an approach and you've got partners, and these are two quite crucial ingredients here, then you're in a position to start exploring together. Notice at the very beginning in introducing Stuart, I said he's the co-author of a book. Exactly. You know, we can start to combine talents and do things together. We don't have to beat the bushes to get everyone to come to our own party. We can partner up with other people, even at the exploration stage, even while we're still putting that value proposition together. I see Kat is commenting on this. Generic requirement to continuously explore ways that we all need should be as much a task as our paid work. Absolutely, Kat. I think of it as working on today's business and working on tomorrow's business. We need to do both. Obviously, if we don't do any work in today's business, we sooner or later run out of cash. If we don't do any work on tomorrow's business, then we also run out of cash just at a future point. The John Harvey Jones line comes to mind. The nice thing about not planning is that failure comes as a complete surprise. Exactly as Kat's just said, there's that generic requirement that we work on today's business and work on tomorrow's business. I'm glad to see something in the chat box other than how to access the webinar. Thanks, Kat. And finally, mindful that all of this is a human journey and not just a business journey, how do we nurture our self-worth along the way? Now, you might say, I would talk about that, but let me just highlight why I believe self-worth is particularly important. You know, I didn't just write a book about it by accident. There's about 5 reasons why self-worth is particularly important when we're navigating our way from the present into the future. Very high on that list is that we often, and this either happens as a total surprise or it comes about by planning, but very often there's a loss of the traditional reference points. And the most obvious ones there are clients. Not only clients, sometimes entire networks disappear. Sometimes entire events or groups disappear, or associations. But very often the traditional reference points that might have defined our world actually change. And when we lose those reference points, and the easiest one to think about is clients, then we can spin into a vortex of who are we in this changing world. The second reason is when you're doing the kind of work Stuart's doing or has been doing, because he's largely done it now, but when you're doing that work, you need to believe in your own worth before others get around to doing it. Because when you're defining that approach, for example, you may not yet at that stage have got to test it on others and on clients. So therefore you have to believe in it. So if your approach is self-esteem based, i.e. coming from the validation that you're getting from the people around you, then this can become a very poisonous chicken and egg problem. Thirdly, there will be setbacks. So you go out there with your first research project or whatever it might be, and you know what? Nobody might be interested. Or you decide to organize an event or a LinkedIn group around a topic and nobody comes, or whatever. One thing we can be all sure of during this navigation is setbacks. And where self-worth is important is not so much in saving you from the setback, because a disappointment is a disappointment. But what it does is it dramatically reduces the recovery time. So when people have self-worth, they bounce back the following day or week if it's really serious, or hopefully hour. But that's the ideal. When people are defining themselves by their own qualifications, their own talents, and their own expertise, and there's no demand for that, then it can create a long slide into depression. And that diminishes our capacity to do the conversations and to do the outreach that we need to do during changing times. So resilience is crucially important. And whether you call it resilience or whether you call it energy or whether you call it something else, bouncing back, whatever, we all get setbacks to deal with. The other reason why self-worth is important is that it enhances your chances to be able to move early, to be creative, to be, I often feel very grateful that I came to coaching during the early adopter years. Frankly, it was an awful lot easier to build a business in the early years of the noughties in coaching than it would be today. There's always opportunities for those who move early. If you've ever read books like the 11 immutable, or was it the 22? The 22 immutable laws of marketing by the author whose name escapes me. Someone help me out. He talks about being the first to occupy a space. Early adopters get the early mover advantage. And finally, there's a piece about energy. An awful lot of energy goes into self-validation. So if your life is self-esteem based, that's nice. It's better than the lack of it. But there's also a lot of cost in maintaining that positive image all the time. Whereas with self-worth, as been written here in 300 pages, so I'm not going to talk about it today. One of the tangible benefits is the energy saving. Because you've got self-worth, you're now free to go out and ask the questions Stuart has been asking, rather than get into another round of introspection and another set of checklists that are all adjectives about you. And for anyone for whom self-worth is, who are thinking about building self-worth with others, as opposed to just for themselves, I couldn't not mention that we have a course coming up in Portugal in November the 3rd to the 10th to be exact, which I forgot to put on the slide, but it is from the 3rd to the 10th of November. And if you want to ping me an email later, I can separately give you details about that. Anything to add, Stuart, while I have a quick look at the chat box? From a human point of view, what has been most significant for you?
I think for me, it's the word I used earlier, which is being curious about the sector that you work in. I think it's just, it's dead easy to get a bit tunnel visioned on what you're working on. Particularly as a project manager, you're lucky in terms of working in different areas. So for example, the last two projects, one's been around digital services in the car industry, and the one before that was around dynamic pricing. So you're able to work in areas that are actually new to the industry, and you need to have a wider appreciation of your industry to understand how those sorts of things would fit in. And I think probably for me, curiosity is the key thing.
Indeed. And curiosity is one of the great gifts of self-worth, because we're then free to be curious rather than tunnel visioned, as Stuart has just been describing. I've just seen Leon's question. Do you believe in the biblical shifts of fortune, such as 7 good years and 7 bad years? In a word, Leon, no. I don't believe that that we're subject to any laws about 7 good years and 7 bad years, except in stories we might tell. Indeed, if you're an independent and if you're not in any way constrained by market share or any of these factors that do apply to global companies, then frankly, it doesn't much matter what the economy around you is doing. What matters is what you're doing. So whether there'll be 7 good years or 7 bad years has actually got very little to do with, it's got no more to do with your fortune than the phases of the moon or a planetary alignment. If we want to build those stories, of course, we're free to do so. But the best way to predict the future, as Peter Drucker said, is to actively create it. So I am far more a fan of curiosity, as Stuart has just described and Fabiana has picked up on. I'm also, given that Fabiana has mentioned motivation, that is incredibly important. If you're positively energized for just another 30 minutes every day than you might otherwise have been, through better motivation, that makes quite a difference. 30 minutes of extra motivation per day, translates into an extra question being asked in a meeting that you might not otherwise have asked. It's an outreach that you've done that you might not have done. It's signing up for an event that you might not have signed up for. So, if all that happens here is the afternoon slump gets a little bit shorter, then over time that starts a very positive spiral in a business. Lots of comments coming in now. Amy is talking about 30 minutes due to self-worth might be a good goal. Indeed it would, Amy. Even 15, actually. I just jumped when I saw the word Theresa followed by the word Brexit. It's just like, I was wondering who was on the webinar there for a moment. She probably is future-proofing her value proposition as we speak. Anyway, back to work. Matt has commented on the balance between focusing on today's work and tomorrow. Any thoughts on how to know when we've got that balance right? Yeah, quite. I don't know if we ever do, Matt, to be honest. I'm not even sure that it is balance. I think of it more as 2 dimensions. Because the problem with balance is that it's a kind of a win-lose, and it's always tricky to get. I think of it more as in every moment, thinking about today and thinking about tomorrow. So it's not so much a question of 3 days a week on today's business and 2 days a week on tomorrow's business, which could be useful. But it's more about infusing our day-to-day thinking and action with what will this look like in 3 years' time? Or how are you affected by the increasing urbanization? Or how are you affected by the changing retail habits of millennials? How are you affected by online shopping? It's more an infusion of the tomorrow orientation into the day-to-day hours. On Teresa's serious point about many clients don't have a budget, of course, they're affected by this too. They are very much affected by this. And it's not just Brexit. Brexit is the tip of the iceberg in the UK. We will see far greater impact from, subjective point of view. I believe we will see far greater impact from AI in the City of London than we will see from Brexit. The focus is very much on political stuff, and we might be missing where the big changes are coming from. And what this webinar is about drawing attention to that and going, hey, the keys are in our hands to decide what our future is, to decide who we're going to work with, to decide what issues we care about enough in order to work on. Lots happening now. Curiosity helps in not having unrealistic expectations. That's really important, actually. Curiosity is a huge help in the client context. So, a few practical steps. Anything to add there, Stuart, before we go into the closing piece?
Catherine's asked about networking with a futurist mindset. I've never considered it that way, but might have to use that as a strap line. But Yeah, I think for me, I'm just very interested in interested in business and in general, and I'm also interested in how things pan out in the future. So the sort of things that I do to support your point, John, and hopefully to answer Catherine's question are, there are always opportunities. You're in the lunch queue and you bump into somebody or you've got 5 minutes at the beginning of a meeting before everybody else turns out. It's the sort of questions you can talk about, as John said, how might this future thing affect you in the next couple of years? It's quite exciting in the auto sector at the moment because there is so much going on that everybody's going to be affected by something. So I don't know if that answers the question, Catherine, but that's the way I do it.
Yeah, it's a great networking question. Any of the future, how will your future be different to the past? How are you affected by ... any of the future questions. Interestingly, they work particularly well with senior leaders because the more senior people have and should have an orientation towards the future. So one of the shifts often I work with people who are trying to work with more senior people in organizations rather than middle managers for whatever reason, because they want to influence the strategy perhaps. Very often one of the techniques is to change from present tense questions to future tense questions. Why? Because that's the language that senior people tend to resonate with. However, it's not a sales skills course. Let's go back to what we're doing here. 5 steps to take now. Okay, this is me campaigning for choice of approach rather than the choice of either me or Stuart or anybody else as your supplier. So please take it in that spirit. Number 1, please make some time to think about the future. Whether you choose to do it while you're driving, whether you choose to do it in your diary, but if we're just plowing on dealing with crisis management and we're not thinking about where we're going, then that gets to be, there may be a price for that. And emphatically, from both a human as much as a business point of view, partner up with somebody, whether you call them a coach or a mentor or a friend or whatever it might be, for a bit of accountability and inspiration, whatever you best need. And I'm going to stipulate 4 things though that when you're choosing that person. Number 1, suggestion: focus on somebody who has a future focus or who has a future orientation versus someone who's got nostalgia for the past, or this is visioning, not therapy, and that's a different skill set. So very often the cozy conversations that we have are nice from a human point of view, but don't necessarily help us to get ready. And for that reason, it is helpful to work with somebody who knows something of your marketplace. Now, they don't have to be as well versed in it as you are, but if you are working in an operation or a technical environment, and you plan to be, then it probably helps to work with somebody who at least knows something of that marketplace. Most importantly, somebody who challenges thinking. We slip into thinking patterns, and it is easy and it's nice to do cozy conversation. This is where the friends and family network isn't always ideal for this type of brainstorming. We need somebody who's going to ask awkward questions. The best conversations that I've had weren't always the most comfortable. This is about getting out of the comfort zone, and somebody who can support you to get out of the comfort zone. But at the same time, and this is equally important, someone who is supportive and cares. I don't care whether they're an introvert or an extrovert, that's not really the point, but do they care about you? I heard a horror story yesterday from somebody who was charged a lot of money to do some of this type of work by somebody who, it became very apparent, simply didn't care other than for the invoice and the collecting payment. And that's equally important because at times like this, we are going through vulnerable transitions. It's fine if you get to do it early on and you can weave it into your delivery. In practice, often there's a clock ticking when this type of work is going on. So you need to be working with somebody who cares about you in that context and not just cares about invoicing you for their services. Back to steps to take now. So that was all about partner up with somebody. Number 3, talk to your current customers. I mean, exactly as it's the curiosity that Stuart has just been talking about and that others have picked up on as well. Talk to current customers and get into inquiry mode. How are you dealing with? What priority does impending regulation change have on your on your sales, for example? How are you dealing with the operational impact of ... Where do you see this in 3 years' time? It's like an interview question turned back the other way. Talk to current customers, get into inquiry mode. It's their world, they will want to talk about it. You may find that some people cannot talk about it, in which case, find other people who can. And of course, and I think Stuart has tangentially referred to this earlier, this is a wonderful reason to reach out to former clients. One of the best reasons, actually, to reach out to former clients or former colleagues or people that were alliance partners on that IT implementation you did 4 years ago and that you've been meaning to contact ever since and forgot. So reconnect with former clients. This is a fantastic way to do it. Create a little inquiry project. You don't have to know the answers. You can be exploring the effects of, or deepening your understanding of, or getting ready for, or whatever it might be. But it is in fact much easier to get these type of meetings or Skype calls, as they often are, much easier to get them in inquiry mode rather than trying to get them in promotion mode. And you'll have a better meeting as a result. And finally, as you do those discussions or cups of coffee or whatever they might be, perhaps start to think about who your future partners might be. Because you're not just networking, for want of a better word. And I'm not sure it's wise to think of this as networking. I think there's better words. But you're not just socializing for clients, you're socializing for possible partners as well. Why? Because they will not only speed up the rate at which you are successful, but they will support you at a human level along the way. So what have I missed, Stuart, before I go to wrap up? The next webinar, by the way, as I see Isabel has just popped out the link, it's how to get a meeting with anyone. It follows a little bit from what we're talking about today. The facilitators course I've mentioned is 3rd to the 10th of November. If you'd like to partner up with me to get some individual support, then the online diary is there, as is my email. What have I missed, Stuart? What would you add to the whole future-proofing conversation?
You pretty much covered most of it. Certainly, well, as an example of what I've done, and I think there's at least one person on the webinar who's part of a little gang of us who a group of freelancers who are future focused, and we're looking at with our combined experience how we could operate within the number of changes that are going to happen in the automotive sector. So we call ourselves the collaborators, for want of a better word. But it's a way of sharing information, sharing leads that allows you to be much better informed about the marketplace that you're working in. Because as a freelancer, you're just one person and you're only working on one thing at once, typically. So therefore, it can be quite hard to see what's going on in the rest of the industry. So I think that's probably the bit that we haven't covered.
Great idea. And I would regard that as a partnership, you know, in the spirit described earlier. When people get together to explore something together, whatever it might be, very useful for independence, very useful for anybody, even in career transition. You know, why do we always take that adventure individually? It's often a lot more useful to form small groups of people informally who do it together. What have you yourself learned, Stuart? So a question out of the blue. What would you say you've learned as you've gone through this journey yourself? You know, if you were speaking to yourself 3 years ago, what would you say?
I think this may have happened by accident because I've had a bit more time over the last 12 months to research the industry wider. That maybe going back 5 or 10 years, I potentially would have spent more time doing it. Not loads of time, but allowing a bit more time in a week to do a bit of searching around the industry and reading the articles that you tend to stick in your, you know, you typically scan read when you read them. What I've been able to do is to read them properly. So I think that's probably the sort of thing that I would tell myself as somebody of an earlier age.
Yep, indeed. Well, on that very what's the word, instructional note or wise note, let's wrap up for today. The link for the next webinar I think is already in the chat, so feel free to register for that, or if you wish, the link will also be in the follow-up email. If there's any aspect of today you want to pick up on further, either with me or with Stuart, then ping me an email and we'll you know, we can or connect with Stuart on LinkedIn, and we can continue the conversation that way. And thanks everyone for participating. Wish you an exhilarating bout of curiosity as you think about the future. Bye for now. How do I end the webinar? Can't find it. There it is. Bye.